Great. So what I'm going to talk to you for, well, I realise I'm also the last talk between you and lunch, so there's a certain pressure to keep to time, isn't there? Is a little bit about some of the maritime archaeology that sits within the Pembrokeshire coast, which quite a lot of it actually, Thomas has just kind of outlined some of the things within the coastal zone, but also within that the work that the Royal Commission does. So I'm the, as it says on here, the senior investigator brackets maritime close brackets at the Royal Commission, which translates to I'm the maritime archaeologist that deals with the stuff from the high water mark downwards. And also, as we see, some of the things that are just sort of like fringing the coastal zone, if you like, as well. So some of you may be unaware of who on earth the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historic Monuments of Wales, what we do, where we work, and what our kind of remit is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then also just give you a bit of a view of kind of how I see maritime archaeology fitting into everything else that happens, and maybe that's something that comes into our discussion this afternoon. Types of sites we deal with, how we do it, and so on and so on. And then a little bit about the National Monuments Record of Wales. I'm not going to talk to you, you'll be relieved to hear about marine planning today. Maybe next year we'll have a talk on marine planning to put everyone to sleep. And then a little bit of the work that I've been, I think, lucky enough to be able to do within the National Park and some sort of areas that are just next to the National Park in the last year or so, looking at a few of the sort of the main site types that we deal with. So I do not expect anyone here or online to read what is on the screen, but it's here as a record. So the commission was established in 1908. We're located up in Aberystwyth within the National Library, and effectively our remit is exactly as the title suggests, to create and collate and maintain and hopefully enhance over time the National Monuments Record of the whole of Wales. And it's quite open-ended in terms of when we start putting things into the Monuments Record from the earliest times, and certainly when we should finish putting things into the Monuments Record. I think the words contemporary culture are written in there. To provide advice, statutory advice to do with planning processes, which I'll touch on briefly, and then to engage the public and promote what we do to allow people to discover what is in the National Monuments Record and to understand everything within Wales as a whole. So the remit of the Commission effectively is from the top of Snowdon right out to the middle of the Irish Sea. Wales has a lot more sea than land, not many people realise. Happy for me in that sense. Because marine planning in Wales is a devolved thing, it's the responsibility of the Welsh Government to do, rather than the government in Westminster. The Commission as the statutory consultee for the offshore zone, our area, if you like, goes down out to that dotted line that runs down the middle of the Irish Sea. So if somebody is building a wind farm or laying a cable or dredging for gravel or whatever it might be, that is all part of this much, much bigger sort of sea area than just what we sometimes think about as the territorial waters around Wales. And what that comprises then in terms of the National Monuments Record is about 120,000 geographically assigned entries. The green ones on the land and the grey ones out in the sea. There's about 8,000 or so beyond the high water mark, and about 50,000 sort of related archive holdings to cover all of those things. And you can explore all of these things for free online. It's all publicly accessible. Nothing is kind of hidden away through the Cov Lane web portal. I should also say at this point, you may go and explore things on there and think that is absolute rubbish, what this says about this site. Please let us know if you find things that are, inaccurate, out of date, that kind of thing. You will appreciate there are 120,000 records and 6 of us. So there's a lot of records to go around. I'm lucky, I only have to deal with 8,000 or so. I think my colleagues get the rough end of the deal in that sense. So we are always open to suggested improvements to what we hold, with a bit of a backup to explain where they come from. In terms of maritime archaeology, there's a very good document that CADU published in 2020 with the maybe less engaging title of Managing the Marine Historic Environment of Wales, which isn't going to instantly grab you, but it actually is a really excellent guide to what there is, how we should think about it, how it's protected, the legislation that covers it, different site types and so on. And really this is useful for sort of defining what we see as maritime archaeology, and specifically because there's only me doing maritime archaeology at the Commission, what I see as maritime archaeology, which is maybe the critical bit, which is really that it's all human activity that we have records for on the coast, under the sea, right out to the deep waters of the Irish Sea, but also some of the landscapes and the traces of people that have been left behind. So it might seem that, yeah, on the screen here we have a piece of submerged forest from Newgale, that in its sense, in itself isn't an archaeological remain, but there are traces of human activity around that and within the peat deposits that surround it. So that's why we are concerned with records of past environment and landscape, as well as the actual traces of the people that have been there. From a site type perspective, and again we've seen a few of these already today in terms of coastal monuments like lime kilns, harbour structures, promontory forts. We'll hear a bit more about a promontory fort later on. And as you sort of go down the foreshore, down into the intertidal area, shipwrecks, fish traps, abandoned quays, the wonderful record of submerged forest landscapes that we have around the Welsh coast, offshore islands, lighthouses, shipwrecks, aeroplane crash sites, the areas of sea that were once land in areas like Cardigan Bay and the Bristol Channel from sort of deep time, if you like. All of that comes under the remit of the maritime archaeological site type. How we look at this is really well explained in this diagram that has been produced as part of the CHERISH project. More on the CHERISH project upstairs. I need to point you to our table upstairs. Please feel free to take as many leaflets, newsletters, and everything like that as you would like. They're all there for your benefit to read up on the project. And really there is, I suppose as we'd see it, effectively a toolbox from which we can take different things depending on the nature of the site, and some of those things Thomas was talking about earlier, and what we're looking to do on the site. And many of these seem like extremely high-tech approaches to things, but I think in nearly all cases these are sort of standard bits of archaeological technology and equipment, be it from aerial-based LiDAR mapping, drone-based photography, geophysical survey, geoarchaeological work through augering, excavation, laser scanning. I think I have never had to abseil down a cliff to look at a site, thankfully yet. I've been spared that. Offshore marine geophysical survey. You know, all of these things are effectively understanding what is our site, what do we want to do to the site or to achieve from surveying the site, and then selecting the right piece of equipment. So we don't end up using a hammer to put a screw in, effectively, this kind of thing. So these are all the things that we can draw upon in our work. Within the commission, really the maritime archaeological element is just one part of everything that the commission does. It shouldn't be seen as a separate thing. Within the UK, maritime archaeology within archaeology for quite a long time was seen as a sort of a separate sub-discipline done by strange people in neoprene suits with odd-looking goggles and air tanks on. And it ended up in a sort of a bit of a bracket by itself. But it's just archaeology. Sometimes there's a slightly arcane way to get to the archaeology, but that is all we are trying to do. So in terms of it within the commission, it is about contributing to the overall National Monuments Record, but specifically looking at the maritime elements of it, fulfilling the Commission's role as a statutory consultee, and then attempting to explain to people, I guess, what we're doing, why we're doing it, what's there, what makes it interesting, what makes it important, and all of these other things. Those records themselves, as you might expect, those 8,000 records which are dotted on the screen there, comprise an awful lot of shipwrecks. Pretty much people have been travelling up and down and across the Irish Sea since, the Mesolithic period, and before that, possibly. Right the way through to the 19th century, the 20th century, and the the 21st century. We are still having things deposited in the sea from ships and of ships that are entering into the National Monuments Record. Many of those ships, as we'll come on to a little bit later, we don't actually have any idea where they are, other than that there might be a record which says a ship was lost off Anglesey or off Skomer Island or off St. David's Head in a year. And we don't know where those things are. So there's 5,000 odd shipwrecks somewhere in the Welsh territorial sea that one day might appear out of the sand or the mud or so on. There's lots of other things, as I've said: aircraft crash sites, fish traps, anchorages, lighthouses, submerged forests, stepping stones, and so on. The site on the screen there is the site of the paddle steamer Albion, which went ashore at Albion Sands, just on the north side of Marlows. And that is a photo from earlier this year when we were undertaking a monitoring visit to the site, when it was as exposed as it has been for many, many years. And you can see in the centre of the site there, those sort of long black rectangles are timber from the hull of the ship, which was largely actually thought to not really exist, but actually there's quite a lot of the wooden hull of that ship surviving. So we were able, by going back to these sites again and again, to have a much better understanding of what's there over time. There are lots of sites that are not, I suppose, beyond the high water mark on the beach, if you like, but are inherently maritime in terms of how they operate, how they were conceived, how they were built. So things like probably my, favourite things actually are coastal lime kilns, which Pembrokeshire is absolutely blessed with. There's an abundance of them in various states of, decay or amazing preservation, depending on which way you want to kind of view them. This is one of the more well-preserved, better looked after examples down at St. Brideshaven, where we were in, what does it say on the screen, the 29th of June, undertaking a survey of this. So we now have a full three-dimensional digital model of this site, principally because, as you can see, just underneath the lime kiln, what looks like a cave there is a process of erosion that is starting to happen on this little promontory. So there's a need to monitor it, and also, thinking unhappily, at some point the whole thing is going to collapse, and it would be nice to have a good, fully sort of immersive three-dimensional record of that site. And this is something that we are now able to do increasingly easily with the technology that we have, in the face of erosion, wildfires, drought, all of these things that destabilise sites, so that if something major does happen, we have a record of what it was like that is more than just a set of photographs. As much as I'm going to say of marine planning is that we also use this information that is held within the National Monuments Record and pulling in local historic environment records, scheduled monuments records and so on, to inform the decision-making process that goes along with the marine planning that we do. So if somebody is, in this case, building a set of sea defences on the North Wales coast, this is a photo from about 10 years ago, but you can see and imagine the level of impact that putting in that kind of infrastructure would have on, for example, a fish trap that might be underneath that cofferdam, or a submerged prehistoric forest, or anything else that is on that stretch of coast, which the sea defences then totally change the sediment dynamics there. So without the baseline information that's contained in the Scheduled Monuments Record and the National Monuments Record and the Historic Environment Record, it's very difficult to turn around to a developer and say, well, actually, you're going to do this. What we'd like you to do is fully record this site or put an exclusion zone around this area. And this work is as relevant in Pembrokeshire as it is anywhere else. I think in the last 12 months, I've had consultation on things as varied as cable laying, aggregates sort of are down in the Bristol Channel that broadly affects here, the big wind farms that are being mooted to put in floating offshore wind farms off freshwater, quite a small scale little geoarchaeological investigations, tidal energy projects in the River Cleddau. All of that has a potential impact on the Maritime Archaeological Record, and therefore the Commission is consulted on it. So to talk a little bit about some of this material for the next sort of 15 minutes, the map on the screen is just a very simple density plot of all of the offshore and intertidal and coastal elements within the National Monuments Record. And you can see there are a couple of really striking spots, one off Holyhead up in the north and one off Milford Haven, which is really looking at the density of wreck material that we have here, also across into St David's Head and scattered around the Pembrokeshire coast out into the Irish Sea are numerous shipwrecks, aircraft crash sites, and then all of the sort of the coastal infrastructure. In last 12 months, in terms of the sites on the screen there, been very fortunate enough to be able to work at, so starting up in the top left, that's the site of a paddle steamer tug at White Sands Bay. An excellent site because it's about 3 miles from where I live, but a very difficult site to get to because it's very much in the surf line, so you can't really access it at low water. It's not a particularly great site for diving on, but it's possible to get a drone up over it at low tide and understand what's there, to actually realise that there's more of the wreck there than you sort of see poking up above the surf line. Just coming down that left-hand side, the tugboats that are wrecked at just underneath Portherrow Promontory Fort, actually at Solva, which are very photogenic, I think, in terms of images that you find online, but also a really interesting case study of what happens to a more modern metal wreck as it breaks up on a rocky coastline. And there's huge amounts of these vessels still there. Seaweed drying hut down in the bottom left, down at Freshwater Bay, which is, again, that's a listed building, but has not ever really been archaeologically recorded, so there's now a full sort of digital 3D model of that. The lime kiln at St Bride's in the centre, and then underneath that, in the absolute middle of that grid, is the cliff colliery at Trefrain at the south end of Newgale, which I visited twice this year, once in March to undertake a bit of a survey of the chimney, and then after it was subject to a quite major wildfire at the end of August, to go back there. And I guess the silver lining of that kind of event is that there is now much more of the archaeological material exposed in terms of the building footings and other buildings that you couldn't see before, that were buried in gorse, that are now visible. What's less clear is the type of damage that kind of event does to, you know, a 120-year-old or so structure of a chimney. The site of the Albion, again down at Albion Sands near Marlows, and then the three sites I'm just going to talk to you about now. Firstly, we're going to visit Newgale, which is one of those sort of iconic beaches in Pembrokeshire, particularly the view looking to the south towards Ricketts Head, and is one of those sites that has a wonderful sort of selection or set of submerged prehistoric forest. Now you're probably looking at this going, there is no forest there, it's just a boulder field and maybe some mud, which is not far wrong actually. What you can see is this big expanse of sort of pebble boulders that get exposed when the sand levels drop, when the sand levels drop on the beach, and this sort of black splodgy thing in the middle is a big thick layer of peat, basically, that is there. And the peat deposits and the submerged forest kind of get interchangeably used. Usually if there's some peat, there'll be some remnants of trees and root systems and branches. You might find footprints in the peat relating to human activity, animal activity, artifacts that have been lodged within there. So they're all kind of one and the same, and it's easier to sort of refer to it as a submerged forest than, splitting hairs on things. Also, quite weirdly at this one, there are things that are definitely not prehistoric in there, like steel and iron I-beams from something, lengths of cable from a ship perhaps, bits of pavement curbstones that I think ended up there maybe in 2014. So there's pretty much 6,000 years of human activity literally stuck in this stuff, all jumbled up a little bit in a few places. But Newgale is one of those submerged forests around Wales, and there's about 50 or so around the Welsh coast, which has been commented on and talked about by people for 800 years or so. So we have this brilliant account from Gerald of Wales recounting other people's stories about the submerged forest there appearing, being cleansed of the sand and being able to see these stumps of trees as if they'd just been chopped down by a hatchet. But it's also one of the forests in Wales that we have no dates for, until recently. Very few samples of the peat, because a lot of the time it is just underneath the sand and it doesn't ever, come up on show. Last year, much of it was exposed, particularly towards the south end. So I was able to get down there in about November, take a sample of some root systems and branches that were near to this 5.5 metre long exposed tree. So you do genuinely get pieces of tree in this forest, which gave a date of sort of 4000 BC or so. So at about the time people were building weird palisade structures up at Llandewi Belfry, there was also a forest growing down at Newgale, which nowadays is completely buried. So we can begin to sort of join up some of the dots of this landscape that people are occupying in the past. So that's the first date that we've been able to get for Newgale. And since then, we've been sat there with the archaeological equivalent of a sort of a rapid reaction force with a percussion auger ready to hopefully go and take some cores on the beach, but sadly the forest is hiding. And despite bouts of force 11 gales and other storm events, it's stayed hiding as well. So if anybody is ever walking along Newgale Beach for any reason at all and you come across large tree stumps and pebble exposures, please let me know. That would be very much appreciated. Or let Thomas know and he can let me know. You can explore this online on our sketch website. You can go and sort of zoom in and have a good look at that. I mentioned a little bit about harbour sites and port sites before, and it would seem that something as obvious as a big stone quay, we would by now have recorded all of these and know where they are because they're very obvious things. But this is not the case. So if we think about the harbour of Lowertown, Fishguard, which again many people are probably familiar with, beautiful little sort of picture postcard harbour, and in the right-hand photo here, just to the north of the harbour is Castle Point, one of the scheduled ancient monuments in the park, which I think last summer I was sort of, I can't forgotten even why I was looking at aerial photographs of this now, and noticed that just inside it, just on the sort of harbour side of it, is a structure which is very much like a stone quay sticking out into the little bay there, but which wasn't in the National Monuments record, wasn't in the Local Historic Environment record, wasn't in any of CADU's records, isn't really shown on any of the Ordnance Survey mapping. So I was sort of left scratching my head a bit thinking, well, it looks like a quay. I mean, why isn't it? Surely this can't have escaped everyone's attention. Had a look at the same photograph from a different angle from our archives, and it looked even more like a quay from this sort of direction. And then went into some of the historical materials that we have in the first instance while I waited for the tide to, come round to be at the right level to sort of go and look at it. And we're very well served within Wales from a maritime point of view by a set of charts that were published in 1748 by a guy called Lewis Morris, who was a self-taught hydrographer from Anglesey, and who published a big scale chart of the Welsh coast from the River Dee round to Tenby with detailed charts of lots and lots and lots of the major anchorages. And his son, William Morris, went and enhanced and improved and extended that to a full map of Wales that was published in 1801. And these are much better than sort of those like the John Speed atlases and things like that you see of, Tudor Wales, which still have dragons and things like that on them and very sort of notional ideas of space and geography. These are quite accurate things, which show on them things like, if I can get some kind of pointer working, maybe for the online people, it might be harder. No, that's not working at all. So if you can imagine yourself in the middle of Goodwick Bay there, underneath the 1 mile scale, it says Weir in that bay, which is an old fish trap, which is still there, and we're heading there next. But it gives us an idea that fish trap, for example, was obviously a very prominent feature when Lewis Morris was making this chart in the sort of early to mid 1700s. And if we zoom on the section of the chart that is for Fishguard Bay, we can see quite clearly there's a big anchor, it says pier, exactly where this thing is that we can now see in some of the aerial photography. Also, as a point of interest, he clearly describes this little headland as Penny Castell, and there's something there, and yet every account of that little fort you read says it was built in the 1780s or into the 1790s. So there's probably some earlier thing there that is, you know, after whatever Iron Age promontory fort there might have been there, but that predates the Napoleonic fort. It's then possible, I guess, to take you to the site and to go and actually visit the site and to really understand that if we can get sort of up above it, courtesy of a small drone, there's a big sort of 30-metre long, 6-metre wide quay that you can begin, although it's been tumbled and it's been robbed for other building work in places, there's quite clear sort of alignments of stones in places. So the next thing with this site would be to go back and do a much more detailed sort of survey of this. It's now been added to the National Monuments Record. Just a bit around the corner in Goodwick, so I think technically outside the National Park for the purpose of today, but you know, adjacent to it and very much impacting on what happens there, is a beautiful expanse of sand where the tide goes out a wonderfully long way, and from my point of view stays out for quite a long time, allowing you a reasonable amount of work time on this site, unlike at Albion Sands where you get about 45 minutes to do anything meaningful on the site. Within this there is loads and loads of archaeological material. So that fish trap I was just talking to you about is this big sort of V-shaped thing that's sticking out of the harbour wall. There's a couple of shipwrecks in there, and the slightly mad-looking map on the left there is sort of getting across the idea that within the shipwreck record of Wales, there are these vessels where we have absolutely no idea where they are. There's the ones that are in the UK Hydrographic Office, where we know there's a thing on the seabed, and then there's a smattering of about 500 where we know there's a thing on the seabed and what it's called and what the date of it is. And sort of one of my major objectives is to increase that number. We'll never get up to 5,000, but if we can get to like 1,500, then we'll have nearly sort of got a name and a date on all of the known sites. Within this expanse of sand, we can again go into some of the historical details, who are people talking about the fact that one of the tactics people used to use to preserve themselves in this area of a generally very good harbour, except when the wind blows from the north, was just simply to sail at the beach, basically, and park their ship on the beach and as a way to sort of save themselves. So within the sands here, there's a couple of shipwrecks, which when you can walk down and visit them very easily, actually. They're one of the sort of more easily visited shipwrecks along the Welsh coast, and are entirely underwhelming when you stand next to a large puddle of water that you can possibly see a few little bits of wood sticking out of, and usually without the benefit of someone having been there first to put a ranging rod at either end of the shipwreck. But again, like so many of these sites now, the advent of very, very small portable drones allows us to quite easily get 10 meters up into the air to be able to see the exact extent of that quite easily, to map it, to be able to understand what's there. In this case, I think what you've got is a ship that has been beached and has effectively fallen over on its side, and you can see part of the outline of it. I think the stern of the ship is possibly to the left, and that line of dots down the middle are probably the beams that ran from side to side that the deck would have been on. The whole thing has tipped over on its side, because when we've been to, I can go back one slide, probe into the sand between these two ranging rods, there's about a metre of sand before you start hitting timber again. So there's an awful lot of this ship in there. It's much more than just the kind of the outline that you see there. We've also been doing some work on this beach. There's another site that again was identified from the aerial photography that is not a new site, it's just actually spotting the thing and again going and recording it. So that's wreck number 2 there. There's probably wreck 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they're all there. And one of the ways to try and identify these is, as Luke was talking earlier, in terrestrial archaeology, is to do a large-scale geophysical survey. But this is not something that's ever been done terribly often in the intertidal zone. So we've started this year doing a bit of trial geophysical work at a few sites where we know there's archaeological material as a means to understand how the geophysics kit interacts with large puddles, salt water, rocks, other things that you don't normally encounter in a, you know, a nice green field somewhere. And it is a good thing, as you might expect, for detecting large pieces of metal. Actually picks up this wooden shipwreck quite well. And it also has been very effective at telling us where there's absolutely nothing, which might sound a strange thing to say as an archaeologist, but if someone was to say, well, we'd really like to lay a cable up this beach, being able to tell them where there's nothing is a really good thing without actually starting to dig large holes everywhere. So this is just sort of part of understanding what's happening at Goodwick, and it's very much something I guess I'd like to be able to in time, just go and do a geophysics survey of the whole beach, and then start going and digging holes in it afterwards to see the shipwrecks. I think I'd really echo what Thomas was saying earlier, though, that the maritime archaeology of Wales is a really fragile thing. There's seemingly quite a lot of it, but it's entirely finite, and unlike much of our amazing natural heritage, it has no ability to regenerate, to regrow, to be reintroduced. When it is destroyed and gone, it is completely gone. So there are lots and lots of challenges to managing it, conserving it, protecting it. But when these things do become exposed, and they are becoming exposed more often because of climate change and coastal erosion and these kind of factors, it does offer us this very, very quick window to record it and understand it before it hopefully becomes covered up again. And I think that, you know, your system of volunteers effectively is showing a way to say, well, if you are out and about and you see stuff, don't go, oh, that looks nice, I wonder what it is. You know, ask somebody. Or you might know what it is already and say, you know, this is exposed. I've never seen it exposed before. It would be really useful if somebody came and just had a look at it. And as heritage agencies, we have to hopefully find ourselves in a position where we can come and look at something, even if just to take a very quick record of it before it disappears again. There are ways to get involved in maritime archaeology through the Nautical Archaeology Society on a UK-wide basis. If anyone is down from Glamorgan or Gwent, which I realise is possibly unlikely today, there's a coastal heritage project up there, or sign up with Thomas's volunteers and branch out into the unscheduled things around the coast. You can explore the National Monuments Record of Wales through Covline. There's an app called the Wales Coast Explorer app, which was launched in April, which is looks at the natural environment, but also has quite a big historic environment element to it to explain different site types, and hopefully to allow you to report when you see things. So that's all of those kind of elements of it. And then I guess with a nod to this afternoon of what is archaeology, is to think about, you know, when should we just ignore things because it's too new to record? And in this particular instance, when I was putting this together, I didn't realise that Dobby's grave down in Freshwater West, which is what this is, would have been splashed all over the international news in the week leading up to this, because the National Trust would have just released their report on the site. This is entirely coincidental. It is quite an interesting thing, though, Dobby's grave. I'll call it a thing rather than anything more subjective. I was down there in May doing some work to record the seaweed hut, and we went and recorded this site as well in quite a lot of detail, mainly thinking that the National Trust might come along and move it, and somebody might want a record of what it looked like before it was moved or before somebody rebuilt it, either here or somewhere else. And it's actually, there's huge potential with this site if it does ever get moved, or even before it gets moved or left, to just the messages on these stones, whatever you think of them, and whatever you think of socks and all the rest of it, are really interesting as a thing. The messages that people write on it who have come very long distances, or just to say, as you've got there, Dobby has no place here. There's both sides of the argument are kind of, inscribed in pebbles at this place. So you can go and ponder that over your lunch break now, whether or not we should be recording Dobby's grave or not.